What would it feel like to move through the world and genuinely feel like you belong in it? Not performing belonging, not working hard to seem connected, not bracing for the moment when the connection dissolves or the other person sees something in you that makes them pull away, but actually feeling in your body, in your nervous system, that you are welcome here, that there is room for you, that the people around you are safe to be with, that you, as you actually are, complicated, imperfect, sometimes struggling, are worthy of genuine connection. For many people listening to this series, that feeling may be hard to imagine, not because they don't want it, but because the nervous system has learned, through long, hard experience, to expect something different. Today we're going to talk about what it takes to change that expectation. Not through discipline or determination, not through pushing yourself into more social situations, not through finding the right people or saying the right things or managing your presentation more carefully, but through something deeper, through working with the nervous system itself, at the level where loneliness is actually being generated. Welcome back. I'm Madeleine Lowry, a neural retraining specialist. This is the final episode of our series on loneliness and the nervous system. We have covered a great deal of ground together. We began by establishing that loneliness is not a character flaw. It is a biological signal, one that carries real and significant consequences for health, including health risks comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We explore the internal patterns that keep genuine connection out of reach: hyper-independence, perfectionism, overgiving, the beliefs of being too much or not enough, and the withdrawal that becomes self-reinforcing over time. We went deep into social anxiety, one of the most common and misunderstood nervous system barriers to connection. We looked at the two-way cycle between chronic illness and loneliness, how each feeds the other, and why treating only the physical dimension of chronic illness so often produces incomplete results. We explored the specific wounds of community rejection and betrayal, the loss of belonging itself, and the tormenting need to be understood by people who are no longer reachable. We talked about the isolating weight of secrets, the loneliness of partial presence, of being known but never fully, of a self that is permanently divided between what is true and what can be said. And in our last episode, we sat with the loneliness of invisible illness, of carrying an experience that others cannot see, that the medical system frequently fails to validate, and that relationships often cannot fully hold. Each of these forms of loneliness is real. Each of them has a nervous system dimension, and each of them contributes to the same fundamental experience, the chronic, unmet need for genuine connection that the nervous system is wired to require. Today we talk about what healing from that looks like, not as an abstract ideal, but as a real neurological embodied possibility. Let me start by clearing away some misconceptions, because healing loneliness is frequently misunderstood, and that misunderstanding can actually get in the way. Healing loneliness is not about becoming more extroverted. Sensitive, introverted people do not need to become social butterflies. The goal is not quantity of connection, it is quality. A nervous system that can be genuinely present in the connections that really matter. Healing loneliness is not about never feeling lonely again. Loneliness is a biological signal. It will arise from time to time throughout any human life, in transitions, in loss, in the ordinary ebb and flow of connection. The goal is not the permanent elimination of that signal. It is a nervous system that can receive and respond to the signal without being overwhelmed by it. and that has enough genuine connection in its life that the signal doesn't become chronic. Healing loneliness is not contingent on finding the perfect community or perfect relationships. Waiting for the external circumstances to be just right before allowing yourself to feel connected is a pattern the nervous system generates, not a reasonable prerequisite for healing. And perhaps most importantly, healing loneliness is not primarily an external project. It is an internal one, because as we have seen throughout this series, the most significant barriers to genuine connection are not primarily out there in the behavior of other people or the availability of community. They are in here, in the subconscious patterns, the stored charges, the learned responses that keep the nervous system from being able to fully receive what connection offers. To understand what healing looks like, it helps to understand what the nervous system actually needs in order to experience genuine connection. The answer at its most fundamental is one word: safety. Not intellectual safety, not the reassurance that nothing bad will happen, but felt safety, a nervous system state in which the threat response is quiet, the body is settled, and the signals of danger that so often accompany social situations are absent or minimal. In that state of felt safety, something becomes possible that is impossible when the nervous system is activated: genuine presence. The capacity to actually be with another person, to listen without monitoring, to speak without editing, to receive care without deflecting, to let someone in without bracing for what might happen when they get there. This is what connection actually feels like from the inside, not a performance, not a managed interaction, but a genuine meeting of two nervous systems in a state of mutual safety. And here is the thing about felt safety. It cannot be manufactured through effort or willpower. It cannot be talked into existence. It is a state that the nervous system either inhabits or doesn't, based on what it has learned to expect. Changing what the nervous system expects is the work of healing. Let's talk about what actually shifts in the nervous system as healing from loneliness occurs. The nervous system, as we've established, is a pattern matching machine. It compares present experience to past experience and responds accordingly. When past relational experience has been characterized by rejection, dismissal, misunderstanding, loss, or danger, the nervous system learns to approach new relational situations with a default of caution, vigilance, or withdrawal. It is not being irrational, it is being consistent with its own history. But that history is not fixed. Through neural retraining, we work with the subconscious mind to neutralize the emotional charges stored around past relational experiences. As those charges dissolve, as the stored weight of past rejection, dismissal, betrayal, and loss begins to lift, the nervous system's default expectation in relational situations begins to shift. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually and often quite naturally. The hypervigilance that was always scanning for signs of rejection begins to quiet. The bracing that preceded social situations begins to ease. The monitoring that ran continuously in the background of our interactions begins to soften. And in the space that opens up, something new becomes possible. Actual attention to the person in front of you. Actual curiosity about them. Actual willingness to be curious about yourself in their presence. And this is the beginning of genuine connection. As we have seen across this series, loneliness in people with chronic illness and chronic symptoms is rarely simple. It is layered. There is the loneliness that comes from early relational experiences, the patterns formed in childhood and carried into adult life. There is the loneliness that comes from specific relational wounds, the betrayals, the rejections, the communities lost, the relationships that couldn't hold what needed to be held. There is the loneliness of the secrets carried, the weight of a self that is never fully allowed to be known. There is the loneliness of not being understood, the accumulated charge of years of dismissal, of explaining and not being heard, of a medical system that couldn't fully see. And there is the loneliness generated by illness itself, the physical contraction of the social world, the loss of roles and identities, the grief of a life that has changed. Healing from loneliness, genuine, lasting healing, requires working through these layers, not necessarily in a perfect order, not necessarily all at once, but with a willingness to go where the charge actually lives, rather than staying on the surface where it can be managed but not resolved. This is what neural retraining makes possible. Working at the level of the subconscious nervous system, not the thinking mind, allows us to reach and dissolve charges that years of insight and understanding have not been able to touch. Because those patterns were never primarily intellectual, they were always neurological. And neurological patterns respond to neurological approaches. In my experience working with clients, certain things tend to shift earlier as the neural retraining process unfolds. The first is often reactivity. Situations that used to trigger an immediate, intense, or destabilizing response begin to feel more manageable, not because the person is forced a different reaction, but because the subconscious charge driving the reaction is no longer as active. The second is often the internal monologue in social situations, the constant self-monitoring, the post-event processing loop, the anxious evaluation of how things landed begins to quiet, not immediately, not completely, all at once, but noticeably. And in that quiet, something becomes available that wasn't before. The actual experience of the interaction, the other person, the conversation, the moment. The third thing that often shifts early is the physical experience of social situations. The tight chest before an encounter, the shallow breathing during it, the exhaustion afterwards. These tend to ease as the nervous system's threat assessment of social connection begins to change. And as the work deepens, the changes that emerge tend to be more fundamental. People often describe a shift in what feels natural to them in relationships. The compulsive self-sufficiency that made asking for help feel impossible begins to soften. Not into dependence, but into a genuine capacity to receive, to let someone carry something with them, to experience the specific relief of not having to hold everything alone. The perfectionist self-presentation that kept the vulnerable parts carefully hidden begins to relax, not into careless oversharing, but into a willingness to be imperfect in someone else's presence, to allow the real, unpolished, sometimes struggling self be visible, and to discover, often with surprise, that this visibility does not drive people away. It actually invites them closer. The bracing around medical encounters, around explaining the invisible illness, around the inevitable misunderstandings of daily life, begins to ease. Not because those encounters become perfectly validating, but because the nervous system is no longer bringing the full accumulated charge of every previous dismissal into every new interaction. And the grief for the communities lost, for the relationships that couldn't hold, for the version of life that existed before illness, begins to find its place, not as something to get over, but as something that has been integrated, that is part of the story, without continuing to write the story of the present. I want to close this series with something that I believe is one of the most important truths. Connection is not simply a reward for healing. It is not something we get to enjoy once we are well enough. Connection is healing. The nervous system is not designed to heal in isolation. It is designed to co-regulate, to find safety and settledness partly through the presence of other regulated nervous systems. This is why genuine connection, the felt sense of being known, accepted, and safe with another person, has such direct and measurable effects on immune function, on inflammatory burden, on sleep, on pain, on the autonomic nervous system's capacity to find its equilibrium. It is not a luxury. It is not secondary to the real work of healing. It is part of the real work of healing. And this means that every step toward genuine connection, however small, however tentative, however imperfect, is also a step towards physical healing. The two are not separate, and they never were. Before I close, I want to speak directly to those of you who are still very much in the middle of this, who are still lonely in ways that feel large and entrenched, who are still carrying the weight of relationships that are wounding, communities that are rejecting, illnesses that are isolating, secrets that divide, who hear the possibility of healing and feel something between hope and skepticism, because you have hoped before and it has not always led where you needed to go. I want you to know your loneliness is not a life sentence. The nervous system that learned to expect disconnection can learn something new. It is not fixed. It is not beyond reach. It is responsive, especially in sensitive individuals, especially when we work at the level where the patterns actually live. The path forward does not require you to be different than you are. It does not require more effort, more discipline, more pushing through. It requires working with the nervous system, gently, specifically at the subconscious level, to dissolve what has kept genuine connection just out of reach. And when that work begins, something often happens that people describe with a quiet kind of awe. Not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual returning to themselves, to others, to the felt sense, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that they belong here, that there is room for them, that connection, real, nourishing, and genuinely felt, is not just something that happens for other people. It is something available to them. Thank you for spending these weeks with me. This has been one of the most meaningful series I have created because loneliness is something so many people carry without ever having it named, without ever having its nervous system dimensions explained, without ever being told that it is not their fault and that it can change. If any part of this series has resonated with you, if you have recognized yourself somewhere in these episodes, I want to invite you to take the next step. Come and talk with me. Let's explore together what this work might look like for you. Let's find out whether neural retraining might be the missing piece in your own healing journey. You can visit tcneuralretraining.com to schedule a free consultation with me by phone or to take our free quiz. And if this series has been meaningful to you, please follow the podcast, give it a positive rating, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The person in your life who is quietly lonely, the one who is living with invisible illness and feels unseen, the one who lost a community and has never quite recovered, the one who shows up for everyone and lets no one fully in. Share it with them, because sometimes the most healing thing is simply knowing that someone understands. Thank you for listening. Content of this podcast, copyright 2026 by Twin Cities Neural Retraining. Music by Barbara Ben.